Hi, I'm Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, and welcome to Treating the Grief of Dashed Life Expectations. Now, I heard someone say the other day, I didn't sign up for this, and they were alluding to a life situation they weren't expecting or hadn't hoped for. But where do we sign up for things? Expectations are forged within the creative cognitive workshop of the imagination. Misuse of the imagination can make us miserable, and learning to use it differently, and sometimes suspend its use entirely, is a massive boon to mental health. Expectation and disappointment track alongside together. We expect things to be a certain way, and we either see what we want to see, a little confirmation bias goes a long way, or we feel shattered when life doesn't produce what we'd led ourselves to expect that it would produce for us. But what about when life itself doesn't turn out the way we imagined? Disappointment and surprise can only happen when we're expecting something else. People who've developed the capacity to take life as it comes and relax with ambiguity tend to be less prone to the grief of dashed expectations. And people with sharp and rigid expectations as to how people, they and life in general should be, get hurt the most. When we relax and soften our expectations, we can, I think, become better able to actually see opportunities where we didn't see them before. We can see what is, not what should be, and so gain in our understanding of life. We can feel happier because we're focused not so much on what is lacking, or we believe to be lacking, but rather on what we actually have. And it seems strange to use the term grief when talking about dashed expectations, but certainly we can and do grieve for the life we'd imagined we were going to live that now doesn't seem to be there for us. And when that doesn't transpire for us, we can feel a deep sense of grief. We can grieve for the person we imagined or assumed someone to be when they turn out most definitely not to be that person that we believe them to be. People can grieve for the life they don't have because it can seem so different to the life they'd always imagined they'd have. Now, grieving the death of a loved one is, of course, entirely natural and not pathological in any way. There are supposedly stages people go through of grieving, such as shock, disbelief and denial, sadness and depression, anger and guilt, and finally acceptance. But I've noticed that people don't have to experience grief in these ways or in any particular order. People will often do it their own way. I've even noticed that people who have had much grief in their life may even get better at grieving and go through the processes more quickly, which is quite a strange thought because we don't usually think of the grieving process as a skill in which someone can improve. So, no one has to experience all of a particular set of emotions in any set order. And people aren't bound to be, for example, in denial or in any of the common features of grief. The other thing that can block the grief process is post-traumatic stress disorder. And I've seen it where the client is stuck at the stage of seeing the loved one die. And they may have flashbacks to that time and they can't even properly grieve the person because they're so stuck in the terror of the memory of seeing the way the person died. So helping lift any trauma around the death will then free the person to grieve and eventually adjust to life without this person and start to move on. So grief is natural, of course, if someone dies that we were very close to. And grief should only become a cause of concern if it doesn't start to diminish after some months and the grief-stricken person starts to believe that they can't possibly have any meaningful existence without their deceased loved one in future. Going into the imagination at this time and projecting into the future and colouring it meaningless in the mind without the loved one is a danger. So we need to know, is our client doing that after a few months? So grief is natural, but how long does it last and at what intensity? Those are key questions. We need to look at our grieving clients' basic emotional needs. Were they solely met through the person who died? Grief tends to be worse if the person doesn't have a strong and supportive social network, for example, around them, or meaningful work to do, and other sources that can fulfill vital and primary emotional needs for them. If you met your needs all in one place and that place disappears, then you're more bereft than if you have eggs in many baskets. So we may need to help them meet their needs again in a wider way in their life, and also help them contextualize their grieving or even organize their grieving. Now, of course, any way of life that we have strongly imagined and started to assume would be our ideal life, or at least expected way of life, but then it doesn't pan out that way, can cause a kind of grieving for those dashed expectations. The thought behind the prevailing feeling is, this isn't how my life was supposed to turn out. This isn't how I imagined things would be. When I was a kid, for example, I expected adult life to be a cross between a James Bond movie, with me as James Bond, of course, and a Star Wars movie. And needless to say, I've had to adjust my expectations somewhat. If we develop really narrow expectations as to what people or things, experiences and everything should be like, then we'll live lives of constant oscillation between expectation, hope and disappointment. I think when we learn to soften our expectations, we become better able to perceive reality as it actually is, not what our imaginations have constructed that it should be like. We don't have to be continually shocked or outraged or bitterly disappointed unless we're being led around by the nose of our own imaginings, which have been shaped by our own minds and often by the imaginings of those around us and even society as a whole. The aspirational good life may not be your construct at all, but one built for you by advertisers and other producers of mass media. So we need to learn to roll with the punches, I think. You know, when a bird flies thousands of miles, it catches air currents in its wings, but it didn't have any foreknowledge of the exact nature of those air currents or where exactly they'd be. It just exists in that moment and adjusts to what is and how that's ever changing. If a child's born with special needs and needs extra care, or if a spouse or partner falls ill and declines, and we now have the primary care of looking after them, or if we ourselves become sick or disabled, or a valued relationship ends, then there'll be a natural sense of loss because we have lost something. And we can remind ourselves it's entirely natural to be upset or sad or even angry during that adjustment period. And without wanting to sound too bleak, suffering, or at least some suffering, is an inevitable part of life. But within that suffering, perhaps we can find something else, whether it's unexpected help from others, untapped strengths within ourselves, or a new appreciation of life itself. So there are sometimes compensations in what at first appears a new way of living, which might seem entirely bleak. I'm not suggesting we glibly say that to the client necessarily, or not in such a crass way, but I think we can remember the truth of that. The future isn't some promised land of perpetual love and money and health and happiness. It, like everything else in the abode that we find ourselves in, contains ever-revolving circumstances and ever-changing patterns of fortune for all of us. Utopianism can be just as dangerous as expecting only bad stuff. We seem to feel moments of true happiness, not when we're continually getting what it is we think we want or thought we wanted, but when we solve problems. Having problems and working around them may be the key ingredients to a happier life. As long as the problems can be negotiated effectively, don't feel overwhelming, and can develop our resources. When working with clients who are living a very different life to the one they expected to live, we might examine what they were expecting to check out perhaps how realistic that was. We then might talk to them about their primal basic emotional needs and how they still need to meet those in as balanced a way as possible given the new circumstances that they now find themselves in and have to adapt to, and also encourage their resolve that they can rise to the challenge of the situation. So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, please hit like and subscribe, and if you want to hear when my next video is published, hit the notification bell below. I'm Mark Tyrrell of Uncommon Knowledge, And if you'd like to subscribe to my email newsletter, you can find it over at unk.com/blog. That's unk.com/blog. And thanks for watching.